moments in history have altered the world as profoundly and as swiftly as the 9/11 terror attacks. Over the course of less than 90 minutes, hijacked passenger planes were flown into the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in Washington, while another crashed in rural Pennsylvania after passengers fought back against the hijackers. The attacks killed 2,996 people, injuring thousands more, and they reshaped global security overnight, including in Britain. The resulting war on terror led to two major conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. These decades-long wars defined a generation and unleashed new forces that we're still dealing with today. But why did a terror attack on the United States have such an important impact on Britain? Well, to answer that, we first need to understand the world as it was before September the 11th.
At the end of the Cold War, the world, at least on the surface, appeared more secure. Conflicts and domestic threats remained a serious concern, yet the idea of an attack on the scale of 9/11 was, for many, almost inconceivable. This was particularly true in the case of the United States, the world's most powerful military and industrial force. In this context, many nations reduced their military spending, embracing what became known as the peace dividend. In the United Kingdom, a series of post-Cold War operations, such as those in the Gulf, Kosovo and Sierra Leone, fostered a sense of confidence that limited, targeted interventions could uphold international order and project national values abroad. However, 9/11 shattered the assumption that any nation, no matter how powerful, was beyond reach. This twisted steel structure, on display at Imperial War Museum Duxford, once formed part of the World Trade Center in New York, one of the main targets on that fateful day. Amongst the nearly 3,000 victims were 67 British citizens. Straight away, Prime Minister Tony Blair declared mass terrorism as the new evil in our world. Britain would soon find itself engaged in two major wars.
The response to the attacks on 9/11 was immediate. Within days, the NATO alliance triggered Article 5 for the first time in its history, recognising that an attack on one member was an attack on them all. This formally tied Britain and other allies to a collective response. Al-Qaeda had planned the attacks from Afghanistan, where they had been hosted by the Taliban since 1996. The US President George Bush gave an ultimatum to the Taliban, demanding that they hand over Al-Qaeda's leaders and close their camps. But they refused. The result was a military intervention on the 7th of October 2001, with the aim of bringing Al-Qaeda to justice, removing the Taliban from power, and preventing the country from becoming a safe haven for terrorism. US Special Forces and CIA operatives had already been infiltrated into Afghanistan to link up with the Northern Alliance, the main opposition group to the Taliban. 2 weeks of airstrikes were followed by a ground campaign led by the Northern Alliance. By December, the Taliban had been driven out of their last remaining stronghold in Kandahar, ending their regime. However, many Taliban and Al-Qaeda fighters fled into the mountains or neighbouring Pakistan, and Al-Qaeda's leader, Osama bin Laden, also disappeared.
In March 2002, Britain launched Operation Jacana, deploying Royal Marines from 4-5 Commando into Bagram, a former Soviet airbase in the north of Afghanistan. The aim was to find any remaining Taliban fighters in the mountains. RAF engineer Craig Hamilton helped establish an operating base at Bagram for the Chinook helicopters needed to drop off and pick up the Marines. The surrounding area was heavily mined and there was no accommodation, power or utilities. As well as the minefields, the other reminders of the Soviet presence were the rusting hulks of military equipment. This MiG-21 aileron section is from the remains of one Soviet aircraft left at the site. It was brought back to the UK by 27 Squadron and signed by the RAF personnel who deployed to Bagram during Jacana. The Soviet occupation of Afghanistan lasted a decade. Few of the personnel who deployed in 2002 would have guessed that British forces would be in the country for almost 20 years.
By early 2002, Britain was also contributing to the UN-created International Security Assistance Force, or ISAF, with troops deployed on Operation Fingal to maintain security in and around the capital of Kabul. They found the city relatively peaceful, with Afghans warily becoming used to a life without the harsh restrictions imposed by the Taliban. Many felt hopeful that this could be a new beginning for the war-torn country. An interim government was appointed, elections were planned, and it looked as if women might finally be able to have a voice in running their country. However, British attention was already turning elsewhere.
This is a damaged bust of Saddam Hussein. It was recovered from Iraq by the Ministry of Defence in 2004. Iraq played no part in the 9/11 attacks, yet the events of that day are critical to understanding why a US-led coalition, including Britain, invaded Iraq in 2003 and overthrew Saddam Hussein. In the wake of 9/11, the British and US governments felt a responsibility to anticipate and remove potential threats before they further developed. They wanted to stop the next 9/11 before it happened. In Washington, Saddam Hussein and his government was no longer viewed as a threat to be contained, but as an imminent danger that had to be confronted preemptively. The British government had already aligned itself closely with the United States in what became known as the Global War on Terror. Prime Minister Tony Blair argued that the threat posed by terrorism and so-called rogue states required decisive action, and that inaction carried risks of its own. The main argument hinged on Iraq's supposed weapons of mass destruction and the potential threats these could pose. The invasion was unpopular with many in Britain. However, the legacy of 9/11 provided sufficient political momentum. The UK Parliament voted to disarm Iraq of its weapons of mass destruction, with 412 MPs voting in favour of military operations.
British forces played a significant role in the US-led invasion, deploying 46,000 troops. Royal Marines fighting alongside coalition forces captured the Al Faw Peninsula within a matter of days. Meanwhile, British Army units like the 1st Armoured Brigade, 7th Armoured Brigade and 16th Air Assault Brigade pushed into southeastern Iraq, capturing the strategically vital city of Basra after nearly 3 weeks of fighting. The defeat of Saddam's regime was another major victory, but the situation in both Iraq and Afghanistan was about to change dramatically. In Iraq, public order soon fell apart. The collapse of Iraqi state institutions created a power vacuum which was exploited by militias, criminal gangs and insurgent groups. Little attention had been paid to planning the next phase of operations, and the all-important weapons of mass destruction had not been found. By 2004, Iraq had exploded into violence, and the British forces in the south had become locked into a battle with the Shia militia known as the Mahdi Army. Meanwhile, in Afghanistan, ISAF missed the opportunity to build on the optimism of 2001. Their decision not to include the Taliban in discussions about the future of the country allowed resentment to build up, and attempts to appease the different tribal factions in the country resulted in deeply unpopular former warlords gaining positions of power. As a result, the Taliban was able to regroup, and in 2004 they announced an insurgency. By now, NATO had assumed control of ISAF operations, and in response to the insurgency, they decided to expand their operations beyond Kabul. Their aim was to widen the authority of the Afghan government to the rest of the country, to provide secure elections and to improve development. But what was really unfolding was a classic case of mission creep.
As part of ISAF's expansion, Britain agreed to take responsibility for the province of Helmand. With British forces struggling in Iraq, a new campaign seemed to offer an opportunity for redemption and a fresh start. In spring 2006, Task Force Helmand, largely consisting of troops from 16th Air Assault Brigade, began arriving in the province. The task force consisted of just over 3,000 personnel, despite warnings that this was exactly the wrong number. Too few to secure the province, but enough to be seen as an occupying force by the local population. British troops met with the revitalised Taliban insurgency. By midsummer, they were engaged in intense combat against a determined enemy. They also became stretched across a number of different locations, including Sangin and Musakala. Under fire in these isolated bases, the resupply of rations and ammunition proved challenging, and they often needed to bring in fire support from fast jets. Subsequent brigade rotations tried different approaches against the Taliban and more troops, but it was increasingly clear that there would be no easy wins in Helmand.
The move into Helmand also had serious consequences for the British forces in Iraq. Troop numbers and resources were already limited, but this added a second high-intensity conflict to an already overstretched force. Neither mission would have the full range of people and equipment that was necessary. On top of that, the situation within Iraq had also worsened significantly. What started as an insurgency had now developed into a civil war between Shia groups like the Mahdi Army and Sunni groups like the newly formed Islamic State of Iraq. In 2007, the US tried to stabilise the situation by increasing the number of forces in the country, a move known as the Surge, but because of resource pressures, the British could not do the same.
By 2007, the British forces were effectively confined to their remaining bases. This battlefield ambulance was damaged by enemy rocket fire at Basra International Airport on the 24th of June 2007. Basra International Airport, the contingency operating base, was consistently hit by mortar and rocket fire throughout the year, with more than 300 rockets hitting the airport in June and August alone. Many soldiers slept in what became known as breeze block coffins to protect themselves from indirect fire. In September 2007, British forces withdrew from Basra Palace, its main base and last foothold within the city, which was now at the mercy and de facto rule of militia groups such as the Mahdi Army. Public opinion back home had already turned against the war in Iraq, and political pressure, combined with the added resource strain, pushed the British to put forward a timeline for withdrawal. They aimed to pull all combat forces out of the country by April 2009. This led to criticism from some in the US, believing that the British were motivated more by short-term political pressure rather than the long-term objective of stabilising and securing peace within the country.
As the British forces in Iraq began to withdraw, additional resources were directed into Britain's campaign in Helmand. Having more troops made counter-insurgency operations more effective. Having cleared an area, ISAF could now stay behind to build patrol bases and checkpoints. This deterred the Taliban from returning and enabled more development to take place. This was combined with an influx of US troops into Afghanistan, including into Helmand, which meant that UK forces could concentrate their larger troop numbers into the centre of the province around major towns like Lashkar, while withdrawing from more isolated outposts like Sangin.
This was the last flag to fly above the main British base in Sangin. It was taken down and folded in the ceremonial style when responsibility for the area transferred from British forces to the Americans in September 2010. The last British troops in Sangin were 40 Commando Royal Marines. Like many of the units that came before them, they endured a challenging time in Sangin, marked by considerable loss. From 40 Commando, 14 soldiers were killed and a further 11 were seriously wounded. Their Regimental Sergeant Major, Martin Pelling, kept the flag after the handover ceremony. He gave it to IWM shortly after 40 Commando returned from Afghanistan in 2010. While the flag had meaning for Martin and his fellow Marines who served under it, it also represents the wider significance of Sangin for UK forces. Almost a third of the total number of casualties sustained by the British in Afghanistan occurred in Sangin.
By 2010, British troops were deploying with greater numbers, improved vehicles and equipment, and more intelligence assets to support them. But a change in tactics by the Taliban had already altered the nature of the conflict. They increasingly used improvised explosive devices, or IEDs, which contributed to an escalation in British casualties. 2009 proved to be the costliest year for British forces, with 108 killed and 157 seriously wounded. Both the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were asymmetric, and this posed major challenges for the British military. They were up against committed enemies, willing to utilise any means at their disposal to harm British troops. Every death was a tragedy. For families and friends, the loss was immeasurable. But each fatality also carried wider consequences. Public support for these wars was already fragile, and so minimising casualties became more than a military necessity, it became a political imperative.
The main British medical facilities in Iraq were located at Shaiba Logistics Base and Basra International Airport. Reaching them quickly and safely from the battlefield often meant relying on helicopters. This flying helmet was worn by Robert Jones, an RAF pilot who flew both Puma and Merlin helicopters in Iraq across multiple tours between 2004 and 2008. One of the key roles helicopters played was as part of immediate response teams. Their role was simple in principle, but difficult in practice. Reach those in danger as fast as possible, extract the wounded, and get them to medical care. The effectiveness of single-rotor helicopters, such as the Puma or Merlin, was the ability to transfer key material and people in built-up urban environments, such as the cities of Basra and Baghdad. It was an intensely stressful job. Pilots and crews repeatedly flew into hostile and unpredictable environments, knowing that every second counted, and that their presence, skill, and professionalism often made the difference between life and death.
Britain left Iraq in 2009, followed by the rest of coalition forces in 2011. However, in their absence, one of the deadliest terror organisations in history was able to take root, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or ISIS. Britain soon returned to Iraq as part of a coalition aiming to push them back. Meanwhile, the medical lessons of Iraq were being applied in Afghanistan.
The immediate response teams used in Iraq were developed further in Afghanistan, but this time using Chinook helicopters. The medical capability on board the Chinooks developed into what became known as the Medical Emergency Response Team, or MERT. With specialists such as anaesthetists on board, the team could start to provide life-saving treatments in the air, improving survival rates for casualties. Anaesthetist Peter Mahoney served in both Iraq and Afghanistan and served multiple times on MERT between 2007 and 2014. He used this camouflage fabric scarf with an unofficial MERT logo on board the Chinook helicopter, so when it came into land he could pull it over his face to keep the dust out and focus immediately on his patient. Peter and other medical professionals who served at the Camp Bastion Hospital and on MERT used their experiences of dealing with different types of injuries to suggest changes to medical equipment and procedures and improvements to kit, such as body armour worn by soldiers on the front line.
In 2011, Al-Qaeda's leader, Osama bin Laden, was killed in Pakistan by US Special Forces. This had been one of the key aims of the war in Afghanistan, but by now the conflict had moved far beyond a response to 9/11. The Americans were increasingly keen to leave and had set a timetable for their departure. International forces soon followed suit, with Britain announcing they would end combat operations in 2014. The training of Afghan security forces was stepped up, ready for them to take over from ISAF, and in Helmand, the British forces began handing over key areas to Afghan troops, dismantling their base at Camp Bastion and moving equipment back to Britain. After leaving Helmand in 2014, Britain retained a small presence in Kabul to provide training and support, which lasted until the summer of 2021 when, as part of a peace deal negotiated by the Americans, all international forces were withdrawn. However, in the aftermath, the Taliban swept through the country, with Afghan security forces unable to hold them back. As the government collapsed, British troops then returned to Afghanistan once again in Operation Pitting to evacuate remaining British citizens and eligible Afghans from Kabul. They performed admirably, evacuating over 15,000 people in 2 weeks. But it was a dispiriting end to Britain's 20-year war. In both conflicts, Britain had helped deliver a decisive initial victory, but it had failed to win the peace, paving the way for more instability and devastation. The wars had cost the lives of 636 British service personnel, bringing a defining period of British military history to a close.
The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq have had a profound impact on British society. A generation have grown up with almost constant news coverage and images from the front line. Many people still carry lasting physical and emotional scars, and strong views have formed about the justification and legacy of both conflicts. But what can sometimes be lost amid the foreign policy debates and political arguments is the experiences of the professional British servicemen and women who were there. They operated under immense pressure and constant scrutiny, often in extraordinarily difficult and dangerous circumstances. More than 1,500 gallantry awards were earned across both campaigns, alongside thousands of commendations and mentions in dispatches, reflecting moments of courage, leadership and selflessness that rarely made the headlines back home. Afghanistan and Iraq themselves were undeniably changed by these wars, in which thousands of civilians lost their lives. Both conflicts trace their origins directly and indirectly to the events of 9/11, a day of enduring historical significance, not only for the United States, but for its allies as well, including Britain.